Hi everyone, my name is James Feeney. Welcome to or back to my channel. Today I'm going to be sharing a few tarot and oracle decks that I actually regret purchasing. So in recent months, I have been culling a lot of my collection, purging decks that I don't use, that I don't resonate with so much anymore, and trying to pare down my collection to decks that I find that I use often, that really align with my style of reading and the imagery and elements that I look for in decks. And in doing this, in sifting through my collection, I've come across a couple that, for one reason or another, entered my collection and I immediately regretted. They never really had their moment. There are a bunch of decks that I am getting rid of that I did enjoy at one point in time, that did have their moment in the sun, and that I had a span of time with, and they really meant something to me in any given moment. But then there are some decks that I purchased and they never really saw any use. They kind of just sat there, and I almost had this immediate reaction where I wished that I hadn't purchased them at all. And while I am getting rid of dozens upon dozens of decks, I just picked out a handful that, for me, for one reason or another, really just I didn't connect with ever at any point, and I thought I would share why that is for me, and in a fun way, not meant to bash the decks or be negative. I think it'll be fun in that maybe some of the qualities that I don't like in decks, you as a viewer do like in decks, so this might serve as sort of mini reviews that offer really helpful recommendations. And if you do find that you have a similar style to me, it might fill you in on a deck that you maybe want to steer clear of if you were thinking of it. And then if it's something that you were potentially looking to purchase and you like the way that I speak about it and the qualities that I see it to have, it might be one for you. So without further ado, we'll get right into this. So the first that I have here is the Herb Crafters Tarot. The artwork is by Joanna Powell Colbert, and it's written by Letitia Guthrie. Show it. I know that this is one that is quite popular in the tarot community, that there are many out there that love it, and I think in theory the idea of it was something that I wanted to like, but that didn't really ever align with my practice or who I was to begin with. I personally don't use herbs a lot in magic or in my spiritual practice. I never have. I don't have much of a green thumb, and I think seeing a lot of other practitioners use herbs and incorporating very natural elements into their practice made me want to do the same and made me feel like I ought to incorporate those sorts of things. And as a tarot reader, getting a tarot deck that had those elements felt like a natural step to sort of merge the two worlds. However, upon getting it and looking through the cards, I immediately knew that I was trying to force myself into something that didn't really align with my interests and spiritual paradigm and practice as it was. I also think I could have done a bit more research in getting this deck, so that way I would have made a more informed purchase if I did choose to go with it. It's a lovely quality deck by US Games. It has a nice cutout here with the ribbon, and it comes with a substantial guidebook that fills you in on practices that some of the herbs are used in, how they're used medicinally and in rituals and in different cultures. And so there's a lot to unpack here for any who are interested. For me, that didn't really make much sense because I wasn't looking to really work with the herbs, or at least there was an aspect or a part of me that felt like I was missing out, a fear of missing out, and that's why I kind of got this deck at that given point. These are the backs. They are beautiful cards, a bit larger than tarot size. It's a thicker deck. US Games has wonderful card stock, and the images themselves are stunning. I do wish I had done a bit more research and known that while this is also a deck that is very plant-based and herb-based, and so it is great for the herbalists out there and the naturalists out there who have a very organic and almost sort of folky practice, it almost seems like. That's a lot of the elements I pick up from this deck. It is more, I would say, feminine in its energy or directive. A lot of the cards and the courts speak to, I would say, what feels like very much like matriarchal lines, mothers and daughters or grandmothers and granddaughters. That's not exactly how it goes, but a lot of the way it's spoken about does seem like it's this sort of familial practice passed down from mother to daughter in the way that it comes across. And while there are no people in this deck, the most that you'll see is maybe like a hand. I'm trying to find court cards. So we have Madre of Water, so Mother of Water. So the courts are all titles that are connected to more feminine ideas. And so that doesn't necessarily connect with me as well. There's no... It almost feels a bit inaccessible to me. I've kind of been reflecting on decks that do encapsulate either feminine and masculine attributes and how I might incorporate them into my practice and use them to work with those energies. And considering herbs don't really factor into my practice, and then also the fact that I identify as a man, it made it sort of inaccessible to me in some ways. And I know that this is a lovely deck for many out there who do have and can incorporate herbs into their practice and do really resonate with more feminine style decks that speak to the idea of mothers and daughters and sort of a matriarchal line. But for me, that's just not for me. So this was an immediate regret, one that maybe saw an initial reading and then went on the shelf and sat there until I decided to cull it from my collection. So wonderful deck, one that I do regret and really never was able to connect with. Now, speaking to the opposite side of the spectrum, when we just spoke to something that was a little bit more natural and feminine in nature, one that I recently showed on my channel that immediately I kind of knew wasn't for me is the Divine Masculine Tarot by Varric and Varric, not Varric, I'm thinking of Game of Thrones, by Vasich and Vasich. So this is a Kickstarter deck that recently came in to my collection, that recently was released and given to the backers. And as soon as I opened it, did the walkthrough and kind of ran through my impressions and thoughts, I knew this wasn't one I would probably be able to use in readings. I do like decks that have both male and female representing or identifying characters within them. I do know that there are a handful of characters in here that are identified as women, but for the most part it's focused on the masculine. And while I do like to work with both feminine and masculine energies in my practice and incorporating them in terms of healing and understanding, in a tarot reading for me, I do need I like balance. And for me, this isn't quite balanced. I think that this could potentially be a deck to work with to better sort of resonate with and understand the masculine in one's practice through reading of the cards, through imagery. And I know that the way that this represents certain individuals is very important for some. However, for me, it just doesn't click. It's a little bit too literal. So the scenes and the way that I tend not to like tarot cards that are so... It almost feels limiting to me when there's a scene that is so specific and detailed. So I'm trying to think of a way to speak on this. So I enjoy the Thoth because it's quite abstract, it's pippish, there's colors. I can go in a lot of different directions based on any given card because I don't feel like it's trying to lead me into something so specific. But when I see, for example, two characters with very expressive faces and a whole scene here that's just very, very specific, to me that feels a bit limiting in a reading, which is why I like more pip style decks and abstract decks that I feel like I have a lot of imaginative room and intuitive room to grow and work from. When I feel like I see an image that speaks to something very finite, I then feel trapped, and it sort of limits the way I can interpret a message, at least for me. And I know that's not the case for many readers out there, and that scenes are actually quite an intuitive springboard, but for me that's not the case. So because this is a deck that to me doesn't feel quite as balanced, and I know that there's a purpose for the way that it is leaning toward the masculine, to me that makes it harder to work with in a balanced way in a reading and to deliver messages. And then the extremely specific and scenic style of this deck does kind of get in the way with the way that I read the cards personally. So this is one that I did regret pretty much on the spot. I think it's a stunning and beautiful deck, and that there's a lot of work that could be done with it, and that there are some out there that this would be amazing for and would work perfectly for. I am just not one of those individuals, so for me this was a regret. Next, moving on to a deck that I got quite some time ago. This is the Angel Tarot by Jane Wallace, and it comes with a book. This is one of those decks that like a series of decks, I guess you could say, that comes in these sort of slide apart boxes. I know there are a bunch like that, like this that I've come across now. I keep it in this bag. I do work with angels quite heavily in my spiritual practice, which is why I thought that this would be a deck well suited to me. These are the backs. It's quite glossy cardstock and not the best quality, but I don't mind that. I'm not too much of a stickler. I don't get too hung up on the cardstock. But yes, these are the backs. That's what it looks like. This is a Pippish style deck, so you will get just the amount of any given suit in the aces through the tens, and you will get a keyword. I'm not a big fan of keywords. Again, something that I find to be a bit limiting, just like the way a very specific scene would be. And you might be thinking you like Bethoth, that has keywords, and I like the way I think that Anna from Anna or Astral Lady Tarot speaks about this. The Thoth sort of what could be perceived as keywords to me are more titles. They speak to this sort of occult correspondence in an area that a card might rule over. And it's a different process. It really does affect the way that I mentally would work with a deck. So these keywords for me do feel a bit limiting, and I don't tend to like keywords on many decks. Although, as I speak to my preferences in any of these sort of decks, there are so many exceptions in my collection, so I'm not trying to seem like a hypocrite when I do have decks that I love that have elements that I don't like in other decks. It's just the way it's done in a certain deck and the combination of elements. But this is a beautiful deck art-wise. The way that these angels are done, they are stunning. I almost wish I had prints of some of them that I could put by my altar. But overall, there's something about this deck that does feel a bit limiting and a little bit too light. So it's not balanced in terms of the way it can deliver a message. It does feel a little bit too love and light for me. I like cards that have darker, more raw elements to them, things that really evoke harder emotions. And so when I see a deck that's quite bright and doesn't really delve into those areas, for me, it automatically makes it harder to read with, and it kind of cuts off the possibilities of a reading. And so for all of those reasons, this is one that I did regret pretty quickly after purchasing. And since then, I have found angel decks that do work for me and ways of working with angels through imagery and cards that does work for me. So yeah, but this just wasn't one of them. So another deck and this is an Oracle deck that I pretty much immediately regretted, and it's a wonderful deck that I know many love. This is the Goddess Oracle deck and book set by Amy Sophia Marashinsky, illustrated by Harana Yanto. I hope I'm pronouncing those names correctly. I apologize if I'm not. But this is one that I know is very well regarded and loved in many practices. The reason that I regretted this immediately is mostly because I already have a deck that fills this role in my collection. I purchased this because of the artwork, because of the way it kind of is raved about and regarded in the community. But then I got it and realized that I pretty much already have what this deck is in my collection. I have the Dark Goddess Tarot. That's one that I hold near and dear, that I use quite often for divine feminine, sacred feminine type work, and also goddess work. And so I really didn't need this deck. It's kind of a redundancy in my collection, and I do like that there are more options in the Dark Goddess Tarot. So I think that the artwork of this deck is stunning. Again, this is one that I think I would love to have prints of some of these goddesses for my altar, for my sacred space. And the book is absolutely wonderful in the way that it describes the history and cultural aspects of any of the given goddesses. But for me, in the Dark Goddess Tarot, the PDF that accompanies that is pretty sufficient. And then there are more goddesses within that. There are the 78, of course, of a tarot deck. I believe this deck has how many? 52, so a bit fewer. The backs I could do without. I think that the artwork is stunning, but this little area of print I could do without. And there is a lot of white space on the front. I'm not too picky about borders and all those types of things, but if I do have to compare two decks and decide which of the same category stay in my collection, the Dark Goddess wins out, hands down. I do love the artwork in this deck, and actually there is a part of me that kind of favors this artwork a bit over the style of the Dark Goddess, but they're just very different. It's like comparing two very dissimilar things, so it's not like it's easy to compare them. And this does actually have the Sheila Na gig in it, which is perfect for me given that I work with the Shio-na-gig, and that was a deciding factor in my immediate purchasing of this deck. But ultimately, I do regret it because there wasn't really a reason or a need for me to purchase it, and as soon as it showed up, I could kind of know that I was probably just going to stick with the Dark Goddess Tarot, and this was going to remain pretty much untouched, and it did. So it's on its way out. It's a lovely deck, and I highly recommend it for any looking to get into goddess work and working with the sacred or divine feminine. But for me, it didn't make sense in my practice. It wasn't very practical. Now, another one that I regret, and this one is one that I don't see around too much. This is the Celtic Tarot. This is a Lo Scarabeo deck, and for one reason or another, almost all Lo Scarabeo decks leave my collection. I don't know if it's the cardstock or the style or the type of decks that they tend to pick up and produce, but almost all Lo Scarabeo decks have left my collection, and I don't think I have any that are staying. I'll have to double check and make sure that that's the case. But I do believe that is how that is, and I'd like to investigate maybe why that is. So this is a deck that investigates or kind of uses Celtic elements. It is a darker deck, actually, and I do appreciate it for that. It almost is a bit too dark, or at least the cards that even seem positive have something sinister to them, and to me, I don't find that to be helpful. So when you get a card and you want to kind of be able to go either way with it, but you look at it and you feel like there's something underhanded about the happiness it may represent, it kind of skews the reading. There is this sort of weird energy I get from this deck that I don't appreciate, and I do work with a lot of Celtic spirituality in my practice. That's sort of the lens and paradigm that I kind of side toward when I'm going for something, and I do have decks already in my collection that do kind of fill the void, fill the niche of Celtic spirituality, and this didn't really do it for me. It didn't offer much in the way of teaching either. There isn't a bigger book that lets me know culturally what's going on or spiritually what's going on, and the little that the book does offer seems pretty dark and sinister. And while I do like cards that are quite evocative and visceral, sorry, my dog is barking, but although I do like cards and decks that have those elements, this to me just took it a step too far. And something about the Lo Scarabeo styling of producing cards makes me use them less. I don't know why that is. And so this was a pretty immediate regret. It didn't get much use. I went for other sort of Celtic style decks when I wanted to use what this deck represented or go for what this deck represented. And then in the handful of times I pulled it out, I got weird feelings from it. So it wasn't one for me, but it may be for you. So this is the Celtic Tarot, and this is by Giacinto Guadenzi and Saverio Tenuta, I believe. I hope this focuses. But yeah, that's that. Only a handful more to go. I didn't want to pick out every single deck I regretted, and there actually are a lot. I did have a portion and many points in my practice where I was prone to making impulse purchases, seeing decks that others used on their channels or in their practice, and thinking that I would maybe get the same feeling that it seemed that they did myself. And so I kind of just went for it without a lot of forethought. And so that definitely contributes to some of the regret in these purchases. There's also the fact that I think finding myself and what works for me and what I like in decks, there was many years where I was still figuring that out, and I think it will continue to evolve and shift. But yeah, these are decks that maybe I thought that I wanted to like, or were kind of trending in a way that I thought I was going and then didn't. So I hope that that comes across in the way that I describe these, because I don't think that any of these are inherently bad or decks that shouldn't be purchased. They didn't work for me, and I can be critical of decks if I need to be, and discerning when I need to be. And of course I am, as somebody who is getting rid of the majority of their collection. So now we have the Goddess Tarot, created by Chris Walder. This is one that I've seen around, and I know it's pretty well liked as well. It's a beautiful deck. These are the backs. They kind of remind me of like this very like Grecian, but also they remind me of a present that is wrapped for some reason, like a wrapped present. And so this might actually be in order. I think it is in order. That's funny. Yeah, no, not much use with this deck. This is another Goddess deck that I got, and then realized that I have the Dark Goddess Tarot, that this didn't make much sense, that if I was looking to work with that sort of sacred feminine or goddess energy, that I would turn to the Tarot of the Dark Goddess or Dark Goddess Tarot. This to me is a softer deck. It is pretty balanced actually in terms of light and dark in the way it can communicate a message. I think that this would be wonderful in certain collections, and the art style to me is very warm and inviting, and so there's something about it that I think would really appeal to some out there. But to me, it was just, again, another deck that felt a bit redundant in my collection, and also there's a lot more goddesses represented in the Dark Goddess Tarot, so if I had to pick and choose, this wouldn't make the cut. And then the way that the artwork is very scenic, again, it can feel a bit limiting. I'm trying to look for examples of that. So yeah, it is pretty traditional. We get the like Two of Pentacles, which feels like Rider-Waite-Smith. For me, I don't see a need in having so many decks that kind of go through that very literal Rider-Waite-Smith-like imagery, just done in different art styles. So that doesn't necessarily appeal to me so much. And so, yeah, this was upon flipping through it, a pretty immediate regret, one that didn't see any use, as you can tell by the fact that it's still in order. And so it's on its way out. Now we have 3 more that I pulled out. So now we have the Chrysalis Tarot, paintings by Holly Sierra, written by Tony Brooks. I do think this is a lovely deck, and this is one that I held off on getting rid of for the longest time because I wanted to like it. I like the idea that it's its own system. It comes with a corresponding guidebook. There was a lot of thought put into the way that this deck was constructed, and I do think the artwork is pretty beautiful. While it is quite scenic, which might not appeal to me, I do think there's a lot of room for someone's intuition to kind of go free. It doesn't feel limiting in the way that the scenes are done. It actually feels quite fantastical, and like you could read into it metaphorically with these sorts of analogies and going in between the lines. And systems that are different from the traditional do appeal to me, and so that's why I really wanted to like this deck. I do think that the artwork for me is a bit too light and soft and fluffy, and it makes it harder for me to take a reading as seriously or to apply it to things that are a bit harsher. So there is that. But for those who side and sort of tend toward that type of imagery and look for the softness so that they maybe don't get smacked with a harsh image, this would be great. I'm not one of those more like Love and Light style deck collectors, or ones that I'm not somebody who looks for that. So when I see decks that are a bit more childlike or soft and almost like it, to me it almost feels like they're holding back something, or again something that's not so balanced. I look for balance in terms of masculine and feminine energies, light and dark. I like decks that can sort of deliver something that can go in a multitude of ways, which is also why I prefer the abstract style or more simple decks where I can really run in my own direction. And a big theme, I think, with a lot of these decks that I'm choosing to get rid of, I like decks that I can study and that have a lot of hidden meaning and occult symbolism with elements and themes and correspondences that I can study and learn about and increase my sort of depth of relationship with that system or deck. And while a lot of these do have sort of certain elements that correspond to certain things, it's not quite enough for me. I think I like decks that I can study for a very long time and find a lot of elements within to sort of keep my interest. So yeah, the Chrysalis Tarot, while in theory would kind of hit the mark for me, there are just some things about it that don't resonate, that I don't connect to, and so I do kind of regret purchasing it, especially because it kind of made me confused for a while as to whether I liked it or didn't, and so I held on to it thinking it would have its moment, and it never did. Next, we have what I would consider a traditional, or more, for lack of a better way of describing it, a more stereotypical style of oracle. This is the Conscious Spirit Oracle deck, written and illustrated by Kim Dreyer. And seeing an image, I think I actually watched a pick a card reading where this was featured, and something about it in the reading style of the content creator or the reader really stuck with me, and so it made me think that this would be one for me. And yes, I think I should have known better than to really latch on to the way another uses a deck and think that it would go the same way for me. That's something that I've had to learn the hard way through getting a lot of decks that just didn't end up working out. But it is a beautiful deck, and I do think that for some it will work wonderfully in their collection and that they will get really great messages and readings out of it, just as this reader on YouTube seemed to be able to read with this deck so fluently and wonderfully and elegantly. So it's one of those decks that sort of has a key word at the top. So we have release, and then a little phrase at the bottom, I release that which does not serve my higher purpose with gratitude and love. So those decks that have key words and really soft images with a sort of phrase that goes on them don't tend to work so well for me. It kind of reads to me a bit more affirmation style, although there are a few cards that speak to sadder elements. This is Nurturing Heart. Let's see. Third eye chakra. So I think the chakras are represented. Yeah, we have the root chakra, third eye chakra. Elementals are in here. So I do think this is great for those who are interested in that style of oracle, ones that tend toward a little bit more affirmation style, and also those who do maybe work with energy and elemental type things. You might find that this works well. There are chakra cards, of course, so there is a lot to be had in this deck for those who enjoy that style, but I do not. So it is a regret. Didn't really get much use, and I'm not the reader who used that in that video, so makes sense. And the final one that I pulled out just randomly is The Art of Love Tarot by Denise Jarvie, artwork by Tony Carmen Salerno. This is, oh yeah, The Art of Love Tarot. I said that. So, comes in this bigger box. I've seen this one on a few channels as well. There's a few reasons why this is a pretty immediate regret. I think I should have known better. This was something that happened in my earlier collecting days when I was sort of experimenting with my style and what I might like in a deck, and for some reason, I had this phase where I purchased decks that I already knew weren't my style, hoping to maybe experiment with them or for them to teach me something or maybe to be pleasantly surprised. And so I don't know exactly what my expectations were in doing this, maybe to broaden my horizons. But for the most part, I would say that the decks I knew I wasn't going to like, I ended up not liking. So I don't know why I did that to myself. But this is one of those. It is centered around love. It does have soft images. It's one of those decks to me that feels a bit unbalanced in that it's a lot more love and light, and it does tend to not deliver things with such a punch. There aren't many harsh images within the deck. These are the backs. It's quite glossy, and the cards do stick together. It's a thicker deck as well, so it's harder to shuffle both riffling and hand over hand, and while I'm not a big stickler for cardstock, it doesn't bother me that much. When it does get in the way of the use of the deck through shuffling, then I guess I do start to become a bit of a stickler for cardstock. So there are a lot of angels present, so I guess that was part of the appeal for me. But it is more about investigating love and doing readings on love of the self for others, just love in general as a concept. And love as a concept is beautiful, something that I incorporate into my practice, but I don't want to read with a deck that feels pigeonholed into one category or style of reading. And so the idea of centering a reading around love, I'd love a deck that is just neutral, and that if I chose to do a reading surrounding or based around love, that I could do that with a neutral deck and sort of investigate it in that way. It just feels more expansive when I can take a deck that can do it all and pick something that I want it to do, rather than have a deck that does one thing really well and then I feel cut off from other elements and styles and messages. So yes, this is one that I did regret pretty immediately. It got maybe a reading or two out of it, and then I realized that this was not the type of reader, the style of reading that I wanted to do so much. Although I do plenty of readings on love, I don't think I work well with a deck that is exclusive to the idea of love in its imagery and purpose. So that takes us through the decks that I regret purchasing. There are a bunch more that I do regret purchasing, but I took these off the top and thought it would be fun to share them. And hopefully, maybe you got a recommendation out of this, and some of these decks are decks that you heard me speak about and feel called to purchase yourself, so all the better. And then if you feel similar with me, if you have similar tastes and preferences, let me know. It's nice to connect and understand where everybody's coming from. I hope you are all well. Like and subscribe if this was fun or interesting, and until next time, bye.